Now that we've gotten the UI and the event handlers all wired up, let's go ahead and test our application. Now, there's a couple ways you can test the application. You can deploy the application to the Windows Phone emulator that comes built in with the developer tools when you install them, or you can deploy it to an actual Windows Phone device. Now, I don't have a Windows Phone device right here. What I have is the emulator. The way that you choose, though, is up here in the toolbar, there's this little drop down that says Windows Phone 7 emulator or Windows Phone 7 device. And since I don't have a device, I'll just leave it on the emulator. And to start the debugging process, I can do that one of a number of ways. I can either click this little green play button right here, which means start debugging, or under the debug menu, I can just choose start debugging. So I'm going to make sure the emulator is chosen, and I'm going to click the little green arrow. Let's bring the emulator back up so you can see it. This is the Windows Phone 7 emulator, and when you install the developer tools, it gets installed along with the Visual Studio IDE. And it really is a full Windows Phone emulation. As far as the code in your application is concerned, it's running on a real phone. This is a virtual machine that contains the full Windows Phone operating system and Silverlight and all that good stuff. So as far as your code is concerned, this is running on a phone. Let's take a quick look at some of the emulator controls. So down here are the back, start, and search buttons that come with every Windows Phone. And we'll see how to deal with those a little bit later. Over here in this toolbar, there's the close, which closes the emulator, and then there's minimize, and those are pretty standard Windows controls. There's also these two controls which control how the emulator is rotated. So to simulate landscape mode, you can just click on one of those buttons and it'll put it in landscape mode. This button right here zooms the emulator, but I'm going to leave it at its current size so you can see it. And then this one here controls the settings. So to test the application, we can go ahead and just start playing with the UI. And if everything is wired up correctly, then every time we click or otherwise interact with the controls, the value of this progress bar down here should update. So let's go ahead and click on the button. And you can see that, yeah, the progress bar, in fact, did update. Let's try the others. There's the checkbox, hyperlink button, radio buttons are responding, and the toggle switch. Let's try making a selection in list box. You can see that that worked. I'll just scroll that up a little bit. So you can see that's working. If I change the value on the slider, you can see that that's working too. And you can also see that the progress bar is correctly looping around, starting at 0 each time it overflows. So we know our code is working, and that's great. But if our code wasn't working, we would need to debug it. So let's see how that works. We're going to switch back over to the IDE here. So here in the IDE, you can see that while we're debugging, these little lock icons have shown up in the title tabs. And what that basically means is I can't change the code because the code is currently running. And if I wanted to stop the code from running, I would just have to choose Stop Debugging up here in the menu. I'm not going to do that, however, because we should just take a look at how debugging is done. Let's switch over to the source code and scroll on down to our code. So to debug, all I need to do is put a breakpoint at the part of the code that I'm interested in debugging. So for example, if I wanted to stop right here before update progress is called, I'll just put a breakpoint on that line. And similarly, I can put a breakpoint in here as well in my update progress routine. And now I can go back to the emulator and interact with the UI, and these breakpoints should trigger when I do the right thing. Okay, so let's try clicking on the button. So you can see that when I click on the button, what happened was my breakpoint got triggered, and it's now holding right here on the update progress call. So what I'm going to do now is step through the code to make sure everything's working correctly. But before I do that, let's take a quick look at the debugging UI. Over here in the call stack, this shows all of the function calls that were made to get to the point where I'm at now. So I clicked on a button, see right there the button on click, and then some other functions got called, and then my event handler got triggered right here. Over here in the locals window, this displays the value of all of the local variables that are currently within the scope of the function I'm looking at. And I can also switch over to the watch window. The watch window just lets me type in any expression that I'm interested in keeping an eye on, and I don't have any right now, but that's what it does. So let's switch back to the locals. And let's step into the onClick function. So for example, when I step over update progress, well, there's a breakpoint in there, so it's not going to let me step over it. So now we step in here, and I can now investigate the code to make sure everything is working fine. So here we have our prog value, and you can see it's currently set to 0. And when I step over it, so I can either step over using F10, or I can step into functions or step out of them, but instead I'm just going to use step over. And that steps over that statement. And you can see now that prog value has now been set to what the progress bar is. And we will add 10 to it. So now you can see it's 30. And when a variable changes in the locals window, its color gets highlighted to red so you can see what changed. Now we're going to test to see if it's more than 100. And it's not, which is correct. So we're going to go ahead and set the progress bar equal to the program value. And to keep on running, I can just go back up here and hit continue. I'll just click this little play button. And the code keeps on running. So that's pretty much how you use the emulator and debugger in Windows Phone 7.